Commander Zextara stood on the bridge of his massive warship and looked at the blue planet spinning slowly in space. His 6 eyes focused on the tactical display that showed Earth getting closer with each passing moment. The planet looked peaceful from this distance, but Zextara knew that would change very soon. His fleet of 200 ships moved through space like a pack of hungry predators approaching their next meal. The Vorthic Empire had been conquering worlds for over 300 years, and Zextara had personally led attacks on 17 different star systems. Each victory had been swift and brutal. Most species surrendered within hours of seeing the massive Vorthic fleet appear in their skies. Those who tried to fight were quickly crushed by superior technology and overwhelming numbers. The pattern was always the same, and Zextara expected nothing different from these humans. His tactical officer Krelix approached with data about the target world. The creatures called humans had only discovered faster-than-light travel about 80 years ago. Their technology was primitive compared to Vorthic standards. They used basic fusion reactors for power and simple kinetic weapons for defense. Their ships were made of common metals that could barely withstand the forces of space travel. Everything about them screamed weakness and easy conquest. Zextara studied the intelligence reports about human society. They were divided into multiple nations that often fought among themselves. Their population was spread across the entire planet with no central authority strong enough to unite them completely. They had recently formed something called the United Earth Defense Council, but it was clearly a desperate attempt to coordinate their pathetic defenses. The humans were like children playing with toys while real warriors approached their door. The Vorthic commander remembered his first battle as a young officer. He had been nervous then, but now conquest felt routine. His warriors were bred for war from birth. Their thick purple skin could stop most projectile weapons, and their 4 powerful arms made them deadly in close combat. Each Vorthic soldier was worth 10 of any other species they had encountered. Combined with their advanced energy weapons and shield technology, they were an unstoppable force. Sub-Commander Krelix reported that several human ships were approaching their position. The vessels were small and clearly not military grade. One appeared to be some kind of diplomatic transport based on its configuration and the signals it was broadcasting. Zextara almost laughed at the sight. These humans actually thought they could negotiate with the Vorthic Empire as equals. The communication request came through standard galactic channels. Zextara accepted the transmission and found himself looking at a human male who appeared to be middle-aged by their species standards. The creature had pale skin and brown hair that was starting to turn gray. He wore what looked like a formal uniform with various insignia that probably indicated rank or authority among his kind. The human identified himself as Director Paul Martinez of the United Earth Defense Council. He spoke in a calm voice about peaceful contact and mutual cooperation between their species. His words were carefully chosen and diplomatic, but Zextara could see no fear in his eyes. This puzzled the Vorthic commander because every other species had shown immediate terror upon seeing his fleet. Director Martinez explained that humanity was interested in establishing trade relationships and cultural exchange with the Vorthic Empire. He offered to share scientific knowledge and resources that might benefit both civilizations. The human spoke as if he were addressing an equal rather than a superior force that could wipe out his entire world within hours. Zextara decided to end this foolish display quickly. He activated his most intimidating voice and explained the reality of the situation to this primitive creature. The Vorthic Empire had come to claim Earth and its resources. The humans had one rotation of their planet to surrender completely or face total annihilation. There would be no negotiation and no compromise. They could submit willingly or be forced into slavery after watching their cities burn. The human listened to these words without changing expression. When Zextara finished speaking, Director Martinez shook his head slowly and replied that surrender was not possible. He offered instead to discuss alternative arrangements that might satisfy both parties. The calmness in his voice never wavered, and he showed no signs of the panic that should have followed such an ultimatum. This response confused Zextara more than he cared to admit. Every other species had immediately begged for mercy or tried to offer tribute to avoid destruction. Some had attempted to flee their home systems entirely rather than face Vorthic wrath. But these humans seemed completely unafraid of the massive fleet that could destroy their world with ease. Krelix whispered that perhaps the humans were too primitive to understand the danger they faced. Some species had been so isolated that they had no concept of interstellar warfare. Maybe these creatures simply could not comprehend the power that now threatened their existence. It was the only logical explanation for their strange behavior. Director Martinez continued speaking about peaceful solutions and diplomatic immunity. He mentioned something called the Galactic Commerce Union and various treaties that supposedly protected developing civilizations. Zexthara had heard of these organizations, but the Vorthic Empire had never bothered to join them. Such groups were for weak species who needed protection from their betters. The human transmission ended with Martinez requesting more time to consult with his government. He promised a response within 12 hours and asked that both fleets maintain safe distances while negotiations continued. The screen went dark, leaving Zexthara staring at empty space where the human face had been moments before. The Vorthic commander ordered his fleet to maintain position while he considered this strange. First contact. Something about the human response felt wrong, but he could not identify exactly what bothered him. Perhaps it was simply the novelty of dealing with a species that had not immediately recognized Vorthic's superiority. Tomorrow would bring either surrender or the complete destruction of human civilization, and either outcome was acceptable to the Vorthic Empire. Admiral Lisa Carter walked quickly through the corridors of Earth Defense Station and tried to process everything that was happening around her. The massive orbital platform buzzed with activity as thousands of personnel prepared for what might be humanity's first and last interstellar war. Every screen showed data about the alien fleet that had appeared at the edge of their solar system just hours earlier. The situation was worse than their worst-case scenarios had predicted. Long-range sensors showed over 200 enemy vessels of various sizes approaching Earth. The largest ships were nearly 3 times bigger than anything humanity had ever built. Their energy signatures indicated power sources far beyond current human technology. Most disturbing of all was the complete lack of any attempt at peaceful communication according to established first contact protocols. Colonel Jake Morrison arrived at the command center carrying a tablet full of intelligence reports. His face showed the strain of processing information that would determine the fate of their entire species. The aliens had identified themselves as the Vorthic Empire, and every piece of data about them painted a picture of a ruthless military civilization built on conquest and domination. Admiral Carter took the tablet and quickly read through the most important files. Human scout ships had encountered refugees from Vorthic attacks in 3 different star systems over the past 5 years. The survivors all told similar stories of overwhelming assault followed by brutal occupation. Entire civilizations had been reduced to slave labor forces, working to extract resources for their conquerors. The Vorthic pattern was always the same according to these refugees. They would arrive with massive fleets and demand immediate surrender. Any resistance was met with devastating attacks on population centers. Those who survived the initial assault were sorted into categories based on their usefulness. The strong became laborers while the intelligent were forced to work on technological projects. The rest were simply eliminated as unnecessary. Dr. Richard Hayes had been studying all available information about Vorthic biology and psychology since the first refugee encounters. His analysis suggested they were apex predators who had evolved on a high-gravity world with multiple competing species. This had shaped them into aggressive territorial creatures who saw all other life forms as either resources to be exploited or threats to be eliminated. The xenobiologist explained to Admiral Carter that Vorthic society was built around a strict hierarchy based on combat prowess and successful conquests. Individual Vorthic gained status by defeating enemies and claiming territory for the Empire. They literally could not comprehend the concept of peaceful coexistence because their entire culture was based on domination through superior force. Captain. Amy Rodriguez received her orders while standing on the bridge of the heavy cruiser New York. Her ship was one of 40 vessels that made up Earth's primary defense fleet. The odds were impossibly bad, but she had trained her entire career for this moment. Her crew of 300 men and women represented the best that humanity had to offer, and they would not go down without a fight. The Earth Defense Council had been preparing for this possibility ever since making contact with those first refugees. Secret shipyards had been working around the clock to build new vessels and upgrade existing ones. Scientists had developed new weapons and defensive systems based on fragmentary data about Vorthic technology. It was not enough to guarantee victory, but it might be enough to make the aliens pay a heavy price for their conquest. Admiral Carter activated the Prometheus defense grid, which brought dozens of orbital weapon platforms online around Earth. Each platform carried enough firepower to destroy a small fleet, but they would only get one chance to use their weapons effectively. The Vorthic shields were reportedly strong enough to withstand sustained bombardment from conventional human weapons. Lieutenant Commander Tony Lewis was assigned to coordinate fighter operations from the carrier Freedom. His pilots were young and eager, but they had never faced real combat before. Training simulations could only do so much to prepare someone for the reality of battle against technologically superior opponents. Lewis knew that many of his people would not survive the coming fight, but they had volunteered anyway. Captain Helen Wright commanded a squadron of destroyers that would serve as the mobile strike force for Earth's defense. Her ships were fast and heavily armed, but they were also fragile compared to the massive Vorthic vessels. The plan was to use hit-and-run tactics to disrupt enemy formations while the orbital platforms provided covering fire. It was a desperate strategy, but it was their only hope. Dr. Hayes continued analyzing Vorthic communications that were being intercepted by Earth's listening posts. The aliens were using standard galactic frequencies, but their language was completely unknown. Computer translation programs were slowly making progress, but most of what they captured was military chatter about ship positions and tactical preparations. One intercept particularly concerned the intelligence team. The Vorthic commander was discussing human defenses with his subordinates, and their tone suggested complete contempt for Earth's military capabilities. They were treating this as a routine operation rather than a serious battle. This overconfidence might be the only advantage humanity possessed. Colonel Morrison reported that civilian evacuation procedures were proceeding as planned. Major population centers were being cleared and essential personnel were being moved to underground facilities. The plan was to make Earth as difficult to occupy as possible, even if the orbital defenses failed. Every city and town had prepared resistance cells that would continue fighting using guerrilla tactics. Admiral Carter knew that they were facing extinction, but she also knew that humanity would not surrender without showing these aliens what they were really made of. Humans had always been survivors who adapted to impossible situations and found ways to overcome superior opponents. This would be their greatest test, but it would not be their final chapter. The communication from Director Martinez had bought them precious time to finalize their preparations. Every minute allowed more ships to reach defensive positions and more weapons to come online. The Vorthic probably expected humanity to spend these hours begging for mercy or attempting futile diplomatic solutions. Instead, they were preparing to give these conquerors the fight of their lives. Captain Rodriguez checked her weapon systems one final time as her ship moved into position near the lunar defense platforms. Her crew was ready, and their resolve was absolute. They would show the Vorthic Empire that humans were not prey animals waiting to be slaughtered. They were warriors who had earned their place among the stars through courage and determination that no alien conqueror could break. Zexthara expected the human fleet to break formation and flee when his ships opened fire, but something completely unexpected happened instead. The primitive vessels turned toward his forces and began shooting back with a coordination that shocked every Vorthic warrior on the bridge. These creatures were not running away like every other species had done. They were actually trying to fight back against impossible odds. Captain Amy Rodriguez felt her ship shake as enemy fire struck their forward shields, but she did not order a retreat. Instead, she commanded her helmsman to plot a course directly toward the largest group of Vorthic destroyers. Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Chris Bell, worked frantically to coordinate point defense systems that somehow managed to intercept most of the incoming missiles. The human ship charged into the enemy formation like an ancient warrior. Rushing into battle, the heavy cruiser New York opened fire with every weapon system as it closed distance with 3 Vorthic destroyers. Human kinetic projectiles moved at incredible speeds and struck enemy shields with devastating impact. The alien vessels had not expected such aggressive tactics from what they considered a primitive species. Their formations began to waver as human ships pressed attacks that should have been impossible. Krelix stared at his tactical display in growing confusion as he tried to understand what was happening. The human vessels were not following any logical battle doctrine that Vorthic computers could predict. They seemed to be making up new strategies as the fight progressed. Individual ships would suddenly change course and attack from unexpected angles while their companions provided covering fire. Lieutenant Colonel Barry Johnson piloted his fighter through a storm of enemy fire as waves of human aircraft swarmed around Vorthic capital ships. His squadron had launched from the carrier Freedom with orders to target enemy sensor arrays and weapon systems. The small craft were incredibly vulnerable to enemy fire, but they moved with such speed and unpredictability that most shots missed their targets. The Vorthic had never encountered opponents who fought with such desperate creativity. Human ships that suffered critical damage would ram enemy vessels rather than surrender. Escape pods from destroyed human craft continued broadcasting tactical information to help their surviving comrades. Every human seemed willing to die rather than submit to Vorthic authority. Commander Tony Lewis led a squadron of destroyers in a maneuver that used Earth's gravity to accelerate their attack run against enemy cruisers. The dangerous tactic required precise timing and perfect coordination, but it allowed the smaller human ships to strike with the force of much larger vessels. 2 Vorthic cruisers suffered severe damage before they could adjust their defenses. Captain Helen Wright watched from her command bridge as human fighters executed suicide runs against enemy ships that had penetrated too far into Earth's defensive perimeter. The young pilots showed no fear as they flew directly into enemy fire to protect their homeworld. Their sacrifice allowed the main battle line to maintain formation and continue fighting. Zexthara found himself experiencing emotions he had never felt before during 3 centuries of conquest. The humans were supposed to be easy prey, but they fought like seasoned veterans who had been preparing for this battle their entire lives. More disturbing was their apparent willingness to die rather than accept defeat. No logical species should fight so hard against such overwhelming odds. The battle raged across the inner solar system as human ships refused to give ground despite taking heavy casualties. Orbital defense platforms fired continuously until their power cells were exhausted. Mobile units darted between enemy formations, launching attacks wherever they could find weaknesses. The humans seemed to have no concept of tactical withdrawal or strategic retreat. Dr. Hayes had been monitoring Vorthic communications from his position in the Earth Defense Station Command Center. The alien conversations were becoming increasingly agitated as their easy victory turned into a prolonged and costly battle. Their rigid command structure was having trouble adapting to human tactics that changed faster than their computers could. Calculate responses. Captain Rodriguez ordered her damaged ship to reconfigure its remaining weapons for close-range combat as 3 Vorthic vessels surrounded her position. The New York had lost its main guns, but her crew was already working to convert mining charges into improvised torpedoes. Human engineering teams accomplished modifications that should have taken hours in a matter of minutes. The improvised weapons proved devastatingly effective against Vorthic hull plating that had been designed to resist energy weapons rather than explosive impacts. The alien ships were forced to fall back as the human cruiser continued fighting with weapons that had been invented during the battle itself. This kind of battlefield innovation was completely outside Vorthic military doctrine. Lieutenant Chris Bell coordinated his ship's defense systems while also analyzing enemy fire patterns to find weaknesses in their targeting computers. He discovered that Vorthic weapons were extremely accurate against predictable flight paths, but became much less effective against erratic maneuvering. This information was immediately shared with all surviving human vessels. The tactical revelation allowed smaller human ships to close with enemy forces that should have destroyed them at long range. Fighters and destroyers began using random course changes and unpredictable attack patterns that confused Vorthic targeting systems. What had started as a massacre was becoming a real battle with uncertain outcomes. Colonel Morrison received reports from across the solar system that painted a picture of desperate human resistance achieving impossible results. Ships that should have been destroyed hours ago were still fighting. Crews that should have surrendered were finding new ways to damage enemy vessels. The humans were learning and adapting faster than any species the Vorthic had ever encountered. Zexthara realized with growing alarm that his warriors were becoming demoralized by the unexpected resistance. Vorthic soldiers were bred to believe in their absolute superiority over all other life forms. Watching primitive humans outfight and outthink them was shaking the foundation of everything they believed about themselves and their empire. The human defense was taking heavy losses, but it was also inflicting damage that the Vorthic had never experienced in previous conquests. Ship after ship reported systems failures and casualty reports that should not have been possible against such technologically inferior opponents. The humans were turning every disadvantage into a weapon and every setback into a learning opportunity. Admiral Carter watched the tactical display and saw that her forces were being pushed back toward Earth, but they were making the aliens pay for every kilometer of space. Human ships continued fighting even when their hulls were cracked and their power systems were failing. The message was clear to anyone watching this battle. Humanity would never surrender, and any species that threatened their world would discover just how dangerous humans could be when they were fighting for their survival. The battle had been raging for 6 hours when Zexthara began to understand the true horror of what his forces were facing. These humans were not just fighting back with desperate courage. They were learning and adapting with each passing minute, in ways that made his advanced tactical computers completely useless. Every time the Vorthic developed a counter for human strategies, the primitives would invent entirely new approaches that no one had ever seen before. Captain Maria Gonzalez proved this point when her destroyer Phoenix lost its main weapons to enemy fire. Instead of withdrawing from the battle like any reasonable commander would do, she ordered her engineering teams to convert the ship's mining charges into improvised torpedoes. The makeshift weapons were loaded into cargo pods and fired from the ships loading bays with devastating results against Vorthic hull plating. Krelix stared at his scanner readings in disbelief as he tried to explain to his commander what had just happened. The human vessel had somehow modified industrial equipment into military weapons during active combat. Their engineering crews were accomplishing tasks that should have required full shipyard facilities with nothing more than basic tools and desperate creativity. The improvised torpedoes punched through Vorthic shields that had been designed to stop energy weapons and kinetic projectiles. The explosive charges detonated inside enemy ships, causing massive internal damage that was impossible to repair during battle conditions. What should have been a damaged human vessel removing itself from combat had instead become an even more dangerous threat. Admiral Carter received constant reports from across the battlefield that painted a picture of human forces that refused to accept any limitation as permanent. Ships with destroyed weapons found new ways to attack. Crews with damaged systems discovered alternative methods to accomplish their missions. The humans seemed to view every setback as simply another problem to solve rather than a reason to surrender. Lieutenant Karen Walsh took command of the cruiser Boston when her captain was injured by enemy fire. She had never commanded a capital ship before, but she immediately began coordinating with nearby vessels to execute a flanking maneuver that caught 3 Vorthic destroyers completely off guard. The aliens had not expected such seamless leadership. Transitions during the chaos of battle. Dr. Hayes continued monitoring enemy communications from his position in the command center and discovered something that made him smile grimly. The Vorthic were becoming increasingly frustrated by their inability to predict human actions. Their battle computers were designed to calculate optimal responses to known threats, but humans kept doing things that had never been tried before in interstellar warfare. The alien command structure was rigid and hierarchical in ways that made rapid adaptation nearly impossible. Vorthic ship commanders needed permission from their superiors before making significant tactical changes. This meant they were always reacting to human innovations, several minutes after those innovations had already been deployed against them. Captain Rodriguez demonstrated the opposite approach when communications with Earth Defense Command were severed by enemy jamming. Rather than waiting for new orders, she immediately began coordinating with other ship commanders using emergency protocols that allowed independent action. Human forces continued operating as a cohesive unit even when their command structure was disrupted. The psychological impact on Vorthic warriors was becoming increasingly obvious as the battle continued. These creatures had been raised from birth to believe they were the ultimate predators in the galaxy. Watching primitive humans outfight and outthink them was destroying their confidence in ways that no previous enemy had ever managed. Lieutenant Commander Tony Lewis led his fighter squadron in an attack pattern that used debris from destroyed ships as cover while approaching enemy capital vessels. The tactic was incredibly dangerous because it required flying through fields of twisted metal and explosive gases, but it allowed the small craft to get within close range undetected. The fighters launched their remaining missiles at point blank range before scattering in all directions to avoid return fire. The surprise attack damaged 2 Vorthic cruisers and forced them to fall back for repairs. More importantly, it demonstrated that humans would use any available resource as a weapon, including the wreckage of their own destroyed ships. ZXTara found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about warfare as he watched his carefully planned assault turn into a chaotic nightmare. The Vorthic Empire had conquered 17 star systems using the same basic strategy of overwhelming force, followed by demands for immediate surrender. Those tactics were completely failing against opponents who seemed to thrive on impossible odds. Captain Helen Wright ordered her damaged destroyer to ram a Vorthic cruiser that had broken through the human defensive line and was heading toward Earth. Her ship was already doomed, but she could still use it as a weapon to protect her homeworld. The collision destroyed both vessels, but it also sent a message that resonated across both fleets. The message was simple but terrifying for anyone who understood its implications. Humans would rather die than submit to conquest. They would turn their own ships into weapons if necessary. They would fight until their last breath and use their final moments to inflict maximum damage on their enemies. This was not a species that could be controlled through fear or intimidation. Colonel Morrison coordinated reserve forces that had been hiding throughout the solar system, waiting for the right moment to strike. Human ships emerged from behind asteroids and planets to attack Vorthic vessels that had become separated from their main formations. The aliens discovered too late that they were not just fighting the ships. They could see but an entire civilization that had prepared every possible hiding place. The tactical innovations were not limited to space combat either. Human boarding parties that managed to reach damaged Vorthic vessels fought with a creativity that completely overwhelmed alien defenders. They used maintenance tools as weapons and turned life support systems into traps. The rigid Vorthic military doctrine had no answers for opponents who could weaponize literally anything. Lieutenant Commander Nancy Price laid one such boarding party onto a crippled enemy cruiser and discovered that Vorthic warriors were completely helpless without their advanced equipment. Removed their technological advantages and they became just another species trying to survive in hostile environments. This weakness had never been exposed before because no previous enemy had been resourceful enough to exploit it. The realization spread through human forces like wildfire as boarding teams reported similar discoveries. The mighty Vorthic Empire was built on technological superiority rather than true military excellence. Their warriors were dangerous when they had every advantage but became vulnerable when forced to fight on equal terms. Zexthara watched in growing horror as his fleet began to disintegrate under sustained human attacks. Ship after ship reported critical damage or complete system failures. His carefully coordinated battle formations had devolved into desperate individual struggles for survival. The humans had turned what should have been a simple conquest into the worst military disaster in Vorthic history. The most terrifying aspect was not the tactical defeat but the strategic implications of what these humans represented. They were not just another species to be conquered and enslaved. They were apex predators who had learned to use tools and technology to amplify their natural abilities. They were creatures who could adapt to any situation and turn any disadvantage into a weapon that no empire in the galaxy was prepared to face. The moment when Zexthara truly understood the meaning of fear came when the humans stopped defending their world and began hunting his fleet like predators stalking wounded prey. Admiral Carter had been waiting for exactly this opportunity as she watched the Vorthic formation begin to show cracks under the relentless pressure of human attacks that never seemed to follow any predictable pattern. The tactical shift happened so smoothly that many Vorthic commanders did not realize what was occurring until it was too late to respond effectively. Ships that had been hiding throughout the solar system suddenly emerged from their concealment behind asteroids and planets to strike at the alien fleet from multiple directions simultaneously. The humans had turned their entire star system into a massive trap. Captain Steve Turner commanded one of these reserve squadrons as they burst from concealment near the asteroid belt and began their attack run against the rear elements of the Vorthic fleet. His orders were simple but devastating in their implications. Target the command vessels first and cut off the head so the body would follow. The humans had been studying Vorthic tactics for hours and had identified exactly where to strike for maximum effect. The surprise attack caught the aliens completely unprepared for assault from directions they had considered secure. Vorthic ships that had been focused on the battle with Earth's primary defenses suddenly found themselves under attack from their flanks and rear areas. Their rigid formation discipline began to collapse as individual commanders tried to respond to threats that seemed to appear from nowhere. Lieutenant Commander Nancy Price led a boarding party that had been hiding inside the crippled Vorthic cruiser Darkstar for over an hour waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When the signal came, her team emerged from their hiding places and began systematically destroying critical ship systems from the inside. The aliens discovered too late that humans could hide anywhere and strike from any direction. The boarding teams had discovered something that would change interstellar warfare forever. The Vorthic were completely dependent on their advanced technology for everything from basic life support to tactical coordination. Remove their technological advantages and they became helpless creatures who had no idea how to fight without their sophisticated equipment supporting every action. Dr. Hayes had been analyzing the psychological profiles of Vorthic warriors throughout the battle, and his conclusions were both fascinating and terrifying. These creatures had never learned to adapt because they had never needed to overcome any significant challenges. Their entire military doctrine was based on using superior technology to crush opponents, before those opponents could develop effective countermeasures. The human approach was exactly the opposite of everything the Vorthic understood about warfare. Humans seemed to thrive on adversity and become more dangerous when facing impossible odds. They treated every setback as a learning opportunity and every disadvantage as a puzzle to be solved through creative problem-solving rather than brute force applications. Captain Rodriguez coordinated with several other damaged human vessels to execute a final desperate gambit that epitomized everything the aliens had failed to understand about their opponents. The ships formed a tight formation and charged directly at the Vorthic flagship while broadcasting surrender messages that were obviously false decoys designed to confuse enemy targeting systems. The coordinated attack broke through multiple layers of Vorthic defenses because the aliens could not believe that damaged ships would attempt such a suicidal assault. When the human vessels opened fire at point-blank range, their weapons caused catastrophic damage to the enemy flagship that forced Zexthara to transfer his command to a different ship. The symbolic impact of this attack resonated throughout both fleets as every warrior watched the mighty Vorthic command vessel burn from internal explosions. The aliens who had seemed invincible just hours earlier were now fleeing from opponents they had dismissed as primitive creatures. Unworthy of serious consideration, Admiral Carter stood on the bridge of her damaged command station and watched as Vorthic ships began breaking formation to retreat toward the edge of the solar system. Her forces had paid a terrible price for this victory, but they had accomplished something that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. They had proven that the Vorthic Empire was not invincible. Colonel Morrison provided the final casualty reports that painted a picture of devastating losses on both sides, but with one crucial difference. The humans had been fighting to protect their homeworld while the aliens had been trying to add another easy conquest to their empire. When the costs became too high, only one side had been willing to continue paying the price for victory. The retreat began slowly as individual Vorthic commanders requested permission to withdraw their damaged vessels for repairs. But as more ships pulled back from the battle, the withdrawal became a general rout that left dozens of crippled alien vessels behind for human forces to capture and study. Lieutenant Colonel Barry Johnson had survived his fighter missions and was now leading rescue operations to recover human personnel from damaged ships throughout the battlefield. His teams also had orders to board any Vorthic vessels that appeared to be abandoned and secure them for intelligence analysis that would provide invaluable information about alien technology. Captain Helen Wright watched the last enemy vessels disappear into hyperspace, carrying with them stories that would terrify the Vorthic Empire for decades to come. The species they had intended to conquer in a single day had instead delivered their first major military defeat in over 3 centuries of expansion. Zex single quotes that are sat in his new command chair aboard a different ship and tried to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. His forces had been defeated not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by opponents who simply refused to accept defeat as a possibility. The humans had turned their supposed weaknesses into strengths and their disadvantages into weapons. The final transmission that Zexthara sent to Vorthic High Command would become one of the most important documents in galactic military history. He recommended immediate reclassification of humans from prey species to extinction-level threat and advised that all operations in the Sol system be permanently abandoned. The message explained that these were not primitive creatures who could be easily conquered and enslaved. They were apex predators who had learned to use tools and technology to amplify their natural abilities. They possessed something that the Vorthic Empire had never encountered before and could never hope to match through superior firepower alone. Admiral Carter received the alien transmission and had it translated by her linguistic teams. The contents made her smile grimly as she realized that humanity had just announced its presence to the galaxy in the most dramatic way possible. Any species that threatened Earth would now know exactly what they were facing. The age of human expansion into the galaxy had begun with a declaration written in the burning wreckage of alien warships. The message was simple but unmistakable to anyone who understood its implications. Humanity would not go quietly into extinction, and any civilization that underestimated human determination would discover too late that they had awakened something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The universe would never be the same because the humans had proven that being the most technologically advanced species did not guarantee victory against opponents who could adapt and evolve during the course of a single battle. The Vorthic Empire had learned this lesson at a cost they would never forget, but other civilizations would have to discover this truth for themselves when they inevitably encountered the species that had turned their first interstellar war into a victory that would echo across the stars for generations to come.